So, Ken, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us in this conversation series. The future is calling us to greatness.
Right. Yeah, well, excellent. Yeah, my pleasure. Delighted to be part of the terrific group of people that you're having this conversation with. It's a good topic and a good item to be discussing.
Cool. Great. Thanks. Well, I was looking forward to this call ever since we met together a few months ago. And
right.
This whole theme, the future is calling us to greatness, is one that I'm finding when I talk to both religious leaders and philosophers and scientists and, people involved in peak oil and, climate change, the whole range of some scary stuff that we're looking at both currently and in the coming decades, and yet how to stay inspired, how to stay in action in the face of that. And so, but before we go into that topic, I'd love to just have you. I don't want to assume that that everybody who's watching or listening to this will know who you are and what you're best known for. So could you please introduce yourself and say, what is it that you're particularly passionate about or are known for?
Okay, well, let me do that by starting to address the question.
Sounds great.
And I'll give exactly an indication of the way I would approach this question is sort of one of the things that I've become a little bit known for.
I should say.
And I would start by saying that one of the things that we've learned over the past couple decades is that when we talk about change, human fundamental change, and this is what we're talking about in terms of how humans are going to meet the future and the call to greatness, is that there are two really very different types of change that human beings can get involved in. And both of them are important, but they're very, very different, and they're not very often recognized. And one of those we could just call horizontal change. And that's where on whatever level of development you're at or stage of growth you're at or wherever it is, that on that level you simply learn a new skill, you learn a new aptitude, you change course. If you have religious beliefs, maybe you'll change belief, possibly from an old mythic literal attitude to a new evolutionary attitude, or you might change your attitude from anger and resentment, love and forgiveness, or so on. Mm-hmm. But all of these are learning new skills, learning new aptitudes, and changing your behavior in that fashion. The other type of change is a vertical change, and it's simply changing levels of consciousness altogether, entirely. Mm-hmm. So this is to a new level of complexity, a new level of consciousness, a complete shift in the fundamental way that you're looking at the world to a fundamentally and entirely new way of looking at the world. Mm-hmm. And as soon as we notice that type of change, one of the big breakthroughs in the last couple decades is to notice that there are fundamentally two different sorts of those vertical changes. And these have been central to the way humans are viewed as having major changes. These two approaches are the two central approaches to human vertical change that humans have adopted over their entire history. But the thing is, they're actually quite different. And they're referring to what turn out to be very different developmental options that humans have. And one path is called waking up, and one path is called growing up. Now, waking up, you find in virtually all the world's great meditative or contemplative traditions. And it's typically just that. It's the path of waking up, reaching an enlightenment or an awakening, or a God consciousness, or Christ consciousness, or Buddha nature. Mm-hmm. And it means going from a small, finite, separate self-sense, often called the ego, to one's true self, which is one with spirit. Sufis call it the supreme identity. And that's maintained to be a move from relative truth to ultimate truth, from finite circumstance to infinite realization.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the various schools of meditation and contemplation, contemplative prayer, East and West, you find that they all give about 4 or 5 major stages of that growth. So Evelyn Underhill, for example, in her classic book Mysticism, after reviewing all Western mystics, maintained that all of them went through about 4 stages. One was starting with purgation, then into an illumination, then into an infinite dark night, and then into a final unity.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at Eastern traditions, they have the same essentially 4 basic stages. They're generally known as the gross state to the subtle state to the causal state to non-dual unity.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one form of vertical change that you can make. And it's quite profound, of course. And individuals that have had an enlightenment experience or an awakening experience, and this can sometimes happen in near-death experiences and so on, it profoundly changes them and irrevocably. But what we've also found is that there's another type of vertical change, because this is also a change in consciousness, a change in levels that goes through stages, but it's very, very different from waking up.
Mm-hmm.
And this waking up has to do with first-person states of awareness. So there are things that are awareness, they're obvious when you experience them, you're directly aware of them. You can introspect and see them. If you have an experience of universal love and bliss and so on, you know it. You're directly aware of it. You can look at St. Teresa's 7 Interior Castles, which is her version of these 4 or 5 meditative stages. You know when you're at each one. It's completely obvious. Now with this other type of development, which is referred to as growing up, these levels, these stages can't be seen by introspecting. These are much more like, let's say, the rules of grammar. Everybody brought up in a particular language-speaking culture grows up speaking the language pretty accurately. They'll put subjects and verbs together accurately. They'll use adjectives and adverbs correctly and so on. In other words, they follow the rules of grammar of that language.
Uh-huh.
And they follow them pretty accurately. But if you ask any of them to write down what those rules of grammar are, none of them can do it.
Exactly.
So they're actually following rules, but they have no idea they're doing it or what they are.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what these developmental stages of growing up are. And they're stages that all human beings go through. We have research on this universally, and well over 40 different cultures have been checked, and we find the same 6 to 8 basic stages of growing up. And one version of them, Gene Gebser gave, and there are dozens of different names for these.
Sure. And
this is just one version. The names are fairly simple and gives a kind of an idea about what the world looks like at these different stages. But he called them archaic, to magic, to mythic, to rational, to pluralistic, to integral.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those are stages. Each of them has a different worldview, a different type of morals, a different sense of identity, and each of them tends to be an expansion of personal identity. So archaic and magic is egocentric. The person is just identified with themselves. And then mythic becomes ethnocentric.
Mm-hmm.
They expand their identity from the self to a group or a number of groups, to the clan, the tribe, the nation, political party, a religion, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But it is one group versus other groups. So it's a very strong sort of us versus them, and it tends to believe in chosen people versus infidels or non-believers and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And then rational is a shift from ethnocentric to world-centric. Here we find a fundamental solidarity with all humans, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. And that, of course, became more common with the Western Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
And the shift from you had to be part of a particular religion in order to get saved to just, as a human being, you had certain universal rights. And the universal rights of men and women came on fore. We started in the 100-year period of the beginning of the Western Enlightenment. Slavery was outlawed from every rational industrial country on the face of the planet. First time that happened in history. So it has a broader stretch of morals, and is the basis of modernity and the modern worldview with the rise of rational science and so on. And then pluralistic was the rise of postmodernity. And this happened particularly starting in the 60s with the student riots, but it involved the civil rights movement and an emphasis on environmentalism and a rise of feminism. And essentially all the marginalized groups were, the whole notion of oppression and exclusion and so on came into view and became a real issue. And the downside of postmodern pluralism is that every culture was maintained to be fundamentally separate and different and incommensurable. So there were no longer any universal truths. Mm-hmm. What's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is true for me, and that can't be challenged. And so they could see all of these wonderful differences in humans, but they couldn't see any of the commonalities. That comes online with the next stage called integral. And Claire Graves, who was a pioneering developmentalist, called this a monumental leap in meaning, because it was a leap to a level where all the previous levels maintained that they had the only truth and reality in existence. All the other levels were wrong, infantile, confused, loopy. But all of a sudden at integral, there was an understanding that all of the previous worldviews had some sort of significance. They were there for some reason. Yep. And so for the first time in human history, really, we had a value set that was inclusive of all other value sets. And he called it a monumental leap in meaning because it was the first genuinely inclusive or comprehensive stage of development that humans had ever seen. Now, you can be at any one of those 6 or 7 major stages of growing up and go through any of the stages of waking up. Mm-hmm. But you'll interpret it according to the stage that you're at. So you can be at mythic and have a mythic literal understanding and yet go all the way to identity or union of the soul and God. You'll interpret it in terms of the mythic structure that you're at. If you're at pluralistic stage, you can go through the same thing and have a waking up experience, but you'll interpret that the pluralistic value structure, and so on. So what we have here, these two forms of growth and development, by the way, we find the waking up in virtually every major meditative and contemplative tradition the world over. And again, we find a great deal of similarity in the stages, and it's the reason that the mystics of all the world's religions tend to understand each other, even though the outward mythic forms of their religions are incompatible and quite different. But none of the meditative systems are aware of these hidden grammar stages. And so that's why you can have, there was a book called Zen at War, for example, which was some very famous, well-known, highly respected Zen masters, clearly enlightened, to the process of waking up, that were at a mythic, ethnocentric level of development, and they were advocating war and, in that sense, murder, and a very ethnocentric orientation, and it was really shocking in some ways.
Sure.
And, of course, a lot of Western Buddhists were very upset by it because they didn't realize that this was possible, but it is possible. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, virtually all of the modern Western developmental models that deal with those stages of growing up, none of them are aware of enlightenment or awakening or anything like that, because they just deal with these hidden grammar stages. They don't look at the stages of waking up, Because in order to see those stages, you have to do those voluntarily. You have to take up a practice of mindfulness or contemplative prayer or gnosis or something that will help people move through these stages of consciousness, because they're not something that people normally grow through. You have to take it up as a voluntary practice of contemplation or meditation. You have to do it 3, 4, 5, 10 years, and it takes a lot of work. So if you're a typical Western psychologist and you're out researching stages of development and all that, you're going to find very few people that are at an enlightened or awakened or so on stage of development. So it's not going to show up in your data. So you just get these other stages there. So we have these two major types of growth. They've never been done together.
Right.
Never been brought together so that you help a person develop two integral levels of growing up while experiencing non-dual unity consciousness of waking up or enlightenment or awakening. And that's it. That's a quick summary.
Well, first of all, that was awesome, because I was going to ask you to give a sort of quick and dirty summary of integral thinking, and that was fabulous. However, I've seen my experience of your work for a couple of decades now is precisely that, bringing these two traditions, these two modalities together and helping people, a wide range of people, East and West, grow in both ways, grow in terms of growing up, but also continue to
wake up.
Yeah, exactly. To wake up. And I'm wondering, your thinking, I mean, it's referred to, in terms of early Ken Wilber and so on. Could you say just a little bit about sort of how your own thinking around this has evolved over the last, say, 25 years or so?
Sure. I started out, and I was always told by my family that I was going to be a doctor and go to Duke University. My mom was from the South and very Southern.
Yeah, sure.
And Dad was from the North and very Yankee. And I did. I went to Duke in the medical program, and as soon as I got there, I knew that that's not what I wanted to do. And because I thought because it wasn't creative enough, so I shifted to a different school and went through a graduate program in biochemistry. And that wasn't doing it either. So I started studying sort of East-West studies. And this was during the 60s. And so you would read, Krishnamurti and Alan Watts and D.T. Suzuki and, all of those original great pioneers. And that started getting me really fired up. And so the more I got into that, though, the more sort of irritated I became, because there turned out to be about 5 or 6 different schools of therapy, using therapy in the very broadest sense of what people do to make them happy. And so this included everything from Gestalt therapy to Zen Buddhism. But people like Freud said, make the ego stronger. People like Zen said, get rid of the ego. Others talked about social and cultural factors that needed to be, handled. Others talked deep ecology. So I went from being simply unhappy to being unhappy and confused. And so I figured that if I was going to get from unhappy to happy, I'd have to get from confused to unconfused first. So I spent most of my time in graduate school not doing what I was supposed to be doing, which was research on vision using cow eyes, and spending all my time reading, the Upanishads and the Gnostic Gospels and Gestalt therapy and Freud and all of that stuff. And when I was 23, I came up with a way that actually all of these schools could fit together. And it was a simple notion that there was a spectrum of consciousness made of a lot of different colors, a lot of different bands, a lot of different sections, and that each of these different schools were dealing with a different color. And so they were accurate when they were dealing with their own color, but they didn't handle the other colors very well at all. But if you put them all together, it came out pretty good. And so that was my first book. It was called Spectrum of Consciousness. and I was 23, and it kind of propelled me into a semi-famous status quickly.
Right.
And so I kept just sort of expanding on that general impulse,
Mm-hmm.
which was every time I go into a field, I generally have the feeling that not that one of these schools was right and all the others were wrong, but somehow all of them were partially right. All of them had something to bring to the picture. And so the question wasn't which of these schools is right and which is wrong, but how can the universe be created such that all of them can be partially right? What picture would hold that?
Yep.
And so that just kept expanding. I went from doing the spectrum of consciousness into book on anthropology, then one on developmental psychology, then one on sociology, then one on world religions. And so I just kept expanding the framework and expanding the framework until after about 25 years, I had what was called an AQAL framework, an AQAL, which was short for all quadrants, all levels, all lines, all states, and all types. And we just went through a brief outline of levels and states, and there's also quadrants and types and developmental lines or multiple intelligences. And so this became a framework that you could literally go into any field you wanted to and turn it into a more comprehensive and inclusive field by sort of filling in the boxes that the field itself was leaving out.
Yes.
And so in the professional journal in the field, called the Journal of Integral Theory and Practice, they've now published articles in over 57 different disciplines, all reinterpreted using this more comprehensive framework. And so that it's actually become, moderately well known. There are a lot of people worldwide that are aware of it, and many that are using it. And so we are starting to see a fair amount of work being done with more comprehensive and inclusive models.
Yes.
And so that's been very gratifying, and the people that are doing it are certainly pleased, with the result, and happy to find something that speaks a little bit more to the fullness and the comprehensiveness of their heart. And so that sort of continuing growth, I think, has been the biggest types of changes that I've gone through over, 65 now. So from basically 25 to 65, I've been doing this for 40 years now, which is weird. I don't feel that old at all. But,
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and I'm glad that you went through that history, because I think I began reading you in 84 or 85, somewhere in there.
Right.
And I've read maybe 8 to 10 of your books, and I've found that what I find so helpful about your model, or evolving models, but really the AQAL model, is it holds more knowledge than practically any other model that I've ever experienced. That is, it helped me, let me speak just personally, it helped me to hold a variety of East and West approaches to knowledge, to insight, to growth, culturally and individually. As you said, finding a way to see the value in a multiplicity of approaches. Right. By holding, sort of this 4-quadrant AQAL model. And, it's interesting. As you were sharing, I'm glad you brought up Jean Gebsard's The Ever-Present Origin, because I sometimes say that the 3 books that I read, voraciously. I love to read, as you do. But the 3 books that I've found to be three of the most important and most difficult books I've ever read. One of them is The Ever-Present Origin by Gebser. Another is Gregory Bateson's Steps to an Ecology of Mind.
Yeah. Yep.
And then Terry Deacon's more recent book, Incomplete Nature. Those three books, I think, took more effort to read than anything I've ever read in my life. And yet, I found Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality easy compared to those three.
Yep. Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, it's a big book. It's an 850-page book, but I think it's written in an incredibly clear fashion. I mean, people really seem to enjoy that part of it, and they go, it was really sentence by sentence. It was easy. It just went on.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a doorstopper in terms of if you look at it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the book that I still to this day, even though it's a little outdated, but not much, the book that I often will recommend for people who have not encountered you before and who are sort of, however they come to learn of your work, I suggest as a good introduction, is that little volume, A Theory of Everything.
Yeah. That's what that was Shambhala Random House decided 10, 15 years ago that they wanted to bring out my completed works for some reason. It made me think instantly that somebody heard I was going to die. Because it just hadn't happened before that they had published somebody's complete works while they're still alive, and I was still I was only 45 or something. So I went ahead and we did that and brought out 8 volumes. There are 2 or 3 books in each volume, and so I wrote introductions for those volumes.
Yeah,
and those turned out to be really, really pretty good. So I just drew all 8 of those introductions together, and that's what A Theory of Everything is.
Oh, that's interesting to hear. Well, I also found it to be the best little short introduction to spiral dynamics.
It covers the stuff.
Even the first chapter on spiral dynamics, I thought, to this day, that's the first way. Anybody who wants to learn about that, I say, read the first chapter in Ken Wilber's
Right.
Well, Ken, could you? I'm wondering if you could begin to let's deal with this question of the past is rooting for us and the future is calling us to greatness. I mean,
right.
what is it that inspires you to wake up on any given day or any given week and to do the work you do without being overwhelmed by some of these large challenges on the horizon?
Yeah, well, it's certainly an issue, and one of the things that makes it just even more fascinating than it already is. I mean, we're facing so many issues now from so many different directions, and it's a toss-up between the issues that are like really astonishing, amazing, sort of good news discoveries. Mm-hmm. And we're undergoing, major revolutions in a half dozen different fields. Yes. I mean, in reality, you see a revolution in one field about every 20 or 30 years. We've got a half dozen of them going all at once. Yeah. I mean, there are revolutions in worldwide marketing and business practices with computer transfers and stuff like that. There's revolutions going on in terms of robotics and artificial intelligence. Those are just getting really spooky, advanced in certain ways. And, of course, past the point that the amount of information stored in computers now exceeds the amount of information in human brains. We're coming on a singularity, and that looks to be sort of outrageous. Mm-hmm. There's all of these new breakthrough discoveries in brain functioning and the neuroplasticity of the brain, and that has an enormous number of implications. And then there are, of course, these interior revolutions, where if we're looking at, for example, these stages of growing up, virtually all of the great pioneering developmentalists had seen just this very, very faint evidence of emergence of a new type of stage. And so often they would describe it as 2 different tiers. And a tier in developmental studies isn't itself a separate stage. It's just the way stages are conventionally grouped. because they have a lot of things in common. And then all of a sudden, at the next stage, something really different comes into existence.
Yeah.
So then they'll group those together as being like a second tier or a third tier, and so on. And that's what we've seen, is that virtually all of the stages leading up to more or less today have all been called either deficiency needs by people like Maslow, or first tier like Graves and spiral dynamics. And then starting today, they saw evidence of what Maslow called being needs, and Graves saw as second tier and called that monumental leap of meaning. And the point is that these stages starting to emerge, and there's less than 5% of the population worldwide at these stages now. But it was only about 1% 2 decades ago.
Right.
So this is really the leading edge of evolution. And it's a type of stage that we haven't ever seen before. And as I was briefly saying, so it's often called integral, or Goethe called it integrally perspectival. Jane Levenger called it integrated. It seems to be a kind of a common word.
Sure.
And the reason is that the characteristics of that stage, unlike every previous stage, which, as I said, each previous stage thinks that its truth and values are the only real truth and values there are. So mythic religious thinks that it's got the only approach to truth. The rational scientific thinks it's got the only approach to truth. Postmodern pluralistic thinks that all knowledge is socially constructed, and so science is no more real than poetry, and they're the only ones that know that, the postmodernists, so they're the ones that are getting it right. It's crazy. Integral stage thinks all of them have some degree of truth, and that they're there for some reason.
Yeah.
And they are, if nothing else, they're all stages in human growth and development. No matter how high a society is, everybody's still born at square one.
Yep.
So everybody's born at archaic, and then from ages 1 to 3, they're at magic. And then from 3 to 12, they're at mythic. And then at 12, rational can emerge, and then at early adulthood, pluralistic can emerge. So but what we're seeing with this new stage of development, this integral or integrated or systemic stage of development, is the possibility of a world that genuinely is inclusive. Now, we just haven't seen anything like that in history. We have no idea how to build a society that would do that. We have no idea what's going to be involved, but it certainly seems, monumentally significant.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, my way of describing, whenever I'm doing a program and I cover some of integral or spiral dynamics or Claire Graves stuff, my sort of simple way of describing it is that first tier or pre-integral, each stage sort of is grounded in a sense that I'm right and you're wrong, or we're right and you're wrong, or everybody ought to think like us. And integral or second tier, it's more coming from the place that our differences are not a problem to be solved. Our differences are a solution to our problems. It's almost like the more the better. The same as in the ecosystem. I mean, the diversity of species in a bioregion is one of the things that leads to the health of that bioregion. And I think the same is true with consciousness, as long as we don't kill each other over our differences.
Exactly. Well, I tend to say that no mind is capable of being 100% wrong.
Yeah, exactly. I love that.
I said nobody's smart enough to be wrong all the time.
Exactly. Well, and I found one of the books that I found, because you were talking about sort of these breakthroughs in all these different areas, and a book that I just read last year. It was fortunately also available in audiobook, recorded by the author, so I was able to read the book and listen along as he was doing it himself. Is Al Gore's book, The Future? I thought it was excellent on that. Yeah.
There's, but that, and given the fact that there is the possibility, even though it's only at about 5% now, and by the way, that's one of the things that makes these a little bit more granular and detailed developmental models a little bit more useful than the spate of books that we've seen over the last decade or two that are all started with the Aquarian Conspiracy and the Greening of America and the Turning Point and all of that. And they basically say that, the world's undergoing a massive change, and then they all have these two columns. One is the old paradigm, and it's always Newtonian, Cartesian, mechanistic, deterministic, et cetera, egocentric, et cetera. And then there's the next column is the new paradigm. And it's all based on quantum mechanics or modern physics, and it's connected, interwoven, and holistic, and oneness, and all of that. And that we're in the process of going from this old paradigm to this new paradigm. And that's just a phenomenally crude way to look at it. Yes. There's actually these 6 or 7, even 8 stages, and humans all start at stage 1. And so we still have a percentage of the population that's at magic. We have a percentage of the population in America, it's about 25-30% at mythic. And they're really fundamentalist believers, are fundamentally at that stage. And then close to 50% of the population is at rational, scientific, modern stages of development, and about 25% at pluralistic, postmodern, and then about 5% at integral.
Yes.
But that still lets us see that there is this transformation occurring. Each stage is more conscious. Each stage is more complex. Each stage has a greater capacity for love. And this was really interesting. For example, Carol Gilligan's studies on female moral development found that they go through 4 major stages. And she called them stage 1. She called selfish. The woman cares only for herself. That's egocentric. Stage 2, she called care, because the woman can extend care from herself to a group. And that's, of course, ethnocentric. And then stage 3, she called universal care. And that's where the woman extends care from a group to all groups, all humans, regardless of race, color, sex, creed. That's world-centric. And then her 4th stage was integrated, which is the women and men both integrate the contrasexual attitude. So men integrate masculine and feminine, and females integrate masculine and feminine. And that's the beginning of our cosmocentric. So those are all occurring. But then in addition to that, we still have this process of waking up. And virtually no Western proponents, except, of course, the ones that are truly spiritual and then mystically spiritual, are even aware of the fact that not only do we have these, growing up stages, there are stages of waking up. And these are profound. These are dealing in moving from, universally maintained to be a movement from relative finite reality to ultimate infinite reality. And that human beings have that capacity. They have a capacity of their humanity to intersect divinity in a supreme identity. And that's an awakening that is truly likened to awakening from a dream state. Our relative conventional finite world is so paltry compared to this awakened, enlightened, liberated state. And those haven't been factored into the picture hardly at all. And when they are, unfortunately, it's too often by people that also are just at a mythic stage of growing up. So they're introducing it in a framework that, the problems with it. You used to be a fundamentalist. It's 2,000 years old. They thought the earth was flat when it was written. It's poetic, wonderfully in certain ways, a certain kind of night knowledge, not so great on day knowledge. And so what we really want to do is be able to top off both of these developmental sequences and come from an integral level of interpretation of a non-dual unity consciousness. Now, that would be a staggering orientation. And they're there for us. Those calls to future greatness in both of those sequences are there. They're realities. They're waiting for us to pick those up. Well, so, that's just astonishing. And at the same time, in the other pan, we have almost as many problems that are catastrophes. We have global warming. We have global epidemics. We have global financial market meltdowns. We have global terrorism. We have a global breakup and regression from world-centric modes back to ethnocentric warlords. Virtually the entire Mideast is nothing but separate fiefdoms of warlords at each other's throats. Eastern countries, from Japan to Korea to Vietnam to China. 1990, they imported 10% of the world's arms. Today, 40%.
Wow.
And they're all in each other's throats.
Yep.
I mean, we have global problems. And global means just that.
No, exactly.
They can't be solved by one nation.
No, exactly. I'm reminded of my dear friend Tom Atlee. He's got this wonderful quote. He says, when people ask me how I think we're doing as a species, he said, it occurs to me that, well, it seems that things are getting better and better and worse, faster and faster.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That is exactly, it's a horse race.
Yes.
And I'm, that classic, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm this way,
Yes.
and Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, I'm that way, and Sunday I can't make up my mind.
Yeah, I sometimes say the same thing in terms of just conservative,
Yeah.
if conservatives who trash liberals and liberals who trash conservatives, neither one of them get evolution. Because evolution, if it's anything, is both a sort of a dance, a spiral dance between the conserving element of society and our own personalities and the liberal progressive element, and both are necessary. So I sometimes say the same thing. On Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm conservative. On Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, I'm liberal, and I flip a coin on Sunday.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that is one of the telling factors about the future that is just dramatically different than it's ever been.
Yes.
Whenever human beings face the future in the past, there were a lot of things that they had in common. There's one thing they never had. They never had a future that was global on both sides. These positive things that are happening to us are happening globally. And the negative potential catastrophes that are happening are also happening globally. And that means, for example, if we take global warming, one nation, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, if a nation had a problem, it could generally take steps and that would cure that problem or ameliorate it. Today, all of our problems are untouchable by individual nations.
Exactly.
The United States could lower its carbon emission to zero, and it wouldn't slow global warming a tenth of a degree. Every nation on the planet has to get involved in this, or it's not going to happen.
Exactly.
And the same is true of global markets and global monetary transfer. It's certainly true of global epidemics, global terrorism. There's nothing a nation can do about any of that. So we're really running up against the whole inadequacy of the nation state in terms of what's happening. And that means slowly some sort of world federation is going to be forming. And of course, we're sort of stumbling towards that in a lot of different ways. And all of these are radically new. There's just nothing in precedent or in history to give us an indication of how to do any of these things.
That's exactly. Yeah,
that's what's so wild about it.
Oh, I know. One of the things that I've been doing a lot lately is sort of what I sometimes say evangelizing big history, taking the history of everyone and everything and helping people experience that in a sacred or inspiring or meaningful way.
Right.
And one of the patterns that I find most hopeful, actually two of them. One is that chaos, breakdowns, destruction keeps catalyzing creative transformation. So it may be the single most important thing is chaos and breakdown. So that gives me some hope. But also that we keep finding ways of broadening our circles of care, cooperation, and commitment, and compassion. And of course, now we need to, we not only need to cooperate, but we need, TV and internet and Twitter and Facebook. These things are actually helping to expand our circles of compassion to include not just other humans, but even other species. And I find that to be hopeful.
Well, and that's one of the things that, interestingly, both of the upper limits of both of these growth sequences have those types of qualities and characteristics. They're both essentially global oriented, globally directed. And so as people continue to move towards those, they continue to be drawn towards more interconnected, interrelated, mutually caring, mutually compassionate, mutually loving. And again, this is also something that's really new. In all of our past, it was very much, as you were saying earlier, it's really us versus them.
Yeah.
And the big choice in your life was to choose the right us. Because if it goes down, you're going with it.
Yeah, yeah.
And, so make sure you're on the right side of something. Crusades, what are you going to be? You're going to be Christian? You're going to be Muslim? Choose carefully. And now it's not that. Now it's the choice is how to be inclusive versus how not to be.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what people find that they're faced with. And incredibly, they push down the barriers of us versus them to an us without a them.
Yes.
And that again, that's radically new.
Yes.
It's a type of identity that human beings have never been asked to grow into.
Mm-hmm.
They've been asked not to, actually.
Yeah.
And so now, though, it's an entirely new ground, an entirely new area and field.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that is noticeable is just all the people that we know, and certainly just all the sort of organizations that you look at that are in various ways, lots of different ways, talking about the same kind of fundamental issues about, wait a minute, we're growing, humanity is changing in some ways, the planet's changing, our political systems are changing, our markets are changing, our medical care is changing, and how we choose is going to have a big hand in what actually happens tomorrow.
Yes. So
in a way that humans really didn't think this way very much throughout most of history,
mm-hmm.
but we are co-creating, co-evolving the future.
Yes.
And we're actually involved in it. We are in some ways directly responsible for the evolutionary unfolding that we get tomorrow.
Yep.
And in the past, it's sort of you got what your genes got you, and that was that. And it was common if you in a particular culture that you were born in a particular shack. If you were born in China for most of its history, you were born in the place that your parents were born. You lived there, you worked the fields there, you died there, you had your kids there.
Mm-hmm.
They grew up there, and for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's all just a completely new world with new rules, and the rules themselves are being written as we go forward, and we're the ones that are writing them.
Yeah, amen. I mean, it's so interesting, this time that we live in. I mean, one of the things that came to mind as you were talking about sort of the path of waking up and the path of growing up.
Yeah.
My own experience over the last 30 years or so has been in some ways, and I didn't have the language like that, but in some ways, almost those two strands in a sort of DNA like spiral where I've emphasized one more than the other at different times in my life. Obviously I'm most grounded in the Christian tradition, but I've also done, week-long retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh and engaged in a lot of Buddhist meditation, but also meditation in sort of more the Christian mystic tradition. Right. And I've come to define meditation as sort of paying attention at the speed of life. I find that to be a useful way because, I found that as I've also grown in terms of the growing up, expanding my worldview, expanding my circle of compassion, and also expanding from just a horizontal sort of this world, sort of an ecological understanding of reality to a deep time evolutionary or big history understanding. Right. I sort of came in the back door to this understanding, and I don't call it enlightenment because that's not been part of the main course of my tradition, but nonetheless, it's been now a decade and a half or close to 2 decades since I habitually have the awareness that thou art that. I don't lose the awareness that I am the universe become conscious of itself, that I am nature uncovering its own nature, that I'm a cell in the body of this divine, whatever you want to call reality, ultimate reality, and that my role is to help awaken others or help others grow, and they're not the same thing, but they're both part of the same process, if that makes sense. It's just an incredible time to be alive.
Yeah, that's the extraordinary thing about about today's world and about the real ways that we have that you're perfectly aware of and have written on. But the real ways we have today of interweaving also science and a genuine spirituality. Mm-hmm. That there is really very, very little about real science, not scientism, mm-hmm. or scientific materialism, both of which, by the way, are not scientific. But most practicing scientists fall into those philosophies as sort of a default. But science knows it can't prove God, but it also knows it can't disprove God. But they keep assuming that they have, and they haven't.
Yeah,
and the proof of God lies in a different direction. It's also a sort of a scientific proof, but it's a science of the interiors. And you also have certain experiments you have to do, and if you do those experiments, you get data, and then that data has to be confirmed with a community of people that have done the experiment and gotten the data. And the experiment is generally some form of meditation, and the data is some form of metanoia, or Christ consciousness, or satori, or awakening, or whatever you want to call it. And then that is generally checked with a community of those who have done that to make sure they're not just hallucinating or making mm-hmm. something up or just having egocentric inflation or whatnot. So there is a proof of God's existence. And you can take 95% of people with scientific PhDs, and if they have a satori experience or a metanoia experience or a Christ consciousness experience, just like that neurosurgeon from Harvard recently did, mm-hmm. And claimed it was the most real experience he'd ever had in his entire life. And, of course, he knows what science is. He's an MD at Harvard. Mm-hmm. But this was more real. This spiritual realization was more real than all the science that he knew. And so there is a proof for God's existence. But the traditions generally make a distinction between ultimate truth and relative truth, and they're both important. So seeing water as composed of 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen atom is relatively true. Ultimately, water is made of spirit. It's a manifestation of ultimate Godhead, ultimate reality. And both of those are real. And so then what you see in terms of ultimate reality and its manifestation of a world, instead of that 6-day poetic version of it, it really unfolds into the same story, but over 14 billion years of a lot more detailed understanding. And evolution becomes spirit's actual mechanism of manifesting this relative world. Yeah. It's spirit in action. And those become completely compatible approaches and actually need each other, because one's going to supply the relative details. Okay, this is how you do a kidney transplant, or mm-hmm. this is what you have to do with working on molecular formulas. So if you want to put a man on the moon or whatnot, you can't do that with a Bible or a sutra or the Quran or anything. It's just not a different field. And so putting together these ultimate truths with these relative truths gives you an overall comprehensive access to the most amount of reality that we can possibly, be aware of.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's to the point now where anything less than that is broken.
Yes.
It's just fragmented and partial and torn and tortured. And we just can't do that anymore. We know too much to go back. And we know it because we have all of the world's cultures available to us.
Yeah.
And when you put all of those together, you get at the very least 2 truths. And they're both important.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I've had my own, just recently, I've created something, sort of I see the 2 biggest expressions of my creativity in the last decade, one being my book, Thank God for Evolution, and the other is a 5-part video series that I just uploaded to YouTube just 3 weeks ago called God in Big History. And one of the things I'm trying to do is say that any God that can be believed in or not believed in isn't God. In other words, God can't possibly be less than a personal face, a sacred name for what's fundamentally, undeniably, inescapably real.
Right.
And any God that's less than that doesn't deserve the name God in any case. And
right.
And that's sort of a bridge building perspective. I mean, only time will tell how this God and big history approach will be received. So far, so good, but it's
Well, that's the thing that comes with this whole understanding of two truths, because the traditional worldwide mystical understanding, anyway, is that when you have a metanoia, and Christianity, by the way, was full of that, particularly in the first 300 years, and the Gnostic Gospels have also made it a lot clearer. But the notion is that there's a deep turning about in consciousness from the mere relative world, mm-hmm. which seen by itself is universally taken to be a world of illusion. And it's only because when you actually have a waking up experience or an enlightenment experience or a metanoia experience that such a fundamentally real reality becomes apparent, that it's clear that's what God is.
Yeah.
Because that's an experience that's infinitely more real than anything in the mere relative or finite world.
Yeah.
But then it's understood that this finite world is a direct expression, is an outpouring, an overflowing of spirit. And so under those circumstances, then it starts to share in the reality of this indubitable, undeniable spirit that you experience when you have this waking up experience.
Yeah.
And that is so profoundly real that you can't possibly doubt it. And that's what God is.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's putting both of these together that we get this overall picture. And then God and big data, God and big history go together, because all of big history is God's manifestation.
Yeah.
It would be actually what Whitehead called part of God's consequent nature.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, there's God's primordial nature, which is, for us, would be sort of the primordial, formless ground of all being.
Right.
And then as it manifests in particular evolutionarily unfolding bits, things, processes, people, animals, and so on. But those are the sum totality of all of those is manifest spirit, or spirit in action.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all contained in what Whitehead called the consequent nature of God.
Mm-hmm.
Because evolution is actually the way spirit is creating these things.
Yeah, yeah.
And so if you take that classic great chain of being, which in the Christian tradition could be said to go from matter to living body to mind to soul to spirit. And that was, as Lovejoy's really classic book called The Great Chain of Being pointed out, that great chain of being was by far the most commonly held worldview
Sure.
of what he called the greatest number of speculative minds, East and West. And it's very true. And then what happened, though, is starting right with the modern era, that great chain, which was a static vertical series of levels, was turned on its side and pushed all the way back to the Big Bang, where there was just the lowest level, matter. And then it unfolded over 14 billion years. The great chain unfolded. It wasn't given all at once at the beginning or in 6 days. So first there was just material things. Mm-hmm. After several million years, living bodies emerged. Mm-hmm. Then after several billion years, minds emerged. Mm-hmm. And we're right at the point now where souls are starting to emerge. And of course, somebody like Teilhard de Chardin is on the way to a spiritual omega emergence.
Yes, yes.
And whether that happens or whether it simply continues unfolding sort of indefinitely remains to be seen.
Yeah.
But this whole notion that these things are somehow fitting together, that spirit as the ultimate ground of all things, and then all things that are manifesting and evolving belong in a comprehensive togetherness, I think is absolutely obvious.
Yeah, yeah, amen. Well, I just want to ask a practical question, which is when you speak to young people, like let's say somebody in their late teens or early 20s is just sort of freaked out about the world. Right. What would you say in terms of a way to encourage them, to support them, to invite them to find the place where their joy and the world's needs intersect? Like, how do you speak to young people who are aware of many of the big challenges, but don't quite know how to be or think or feel their way through to inspired action.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that we have to deal with in these circumstances, which is that we are facing these global issues, and they are truly, in terms of issues, they're of global stretch. So that can be intimidating because it doesn't seem that there's any particular thing that you can do that's going to have an impact on something that big. But if you actually look at how development occurs, and you look at morphogenesis in biology, for example, you study embryo growth and development, it becomes really clear, and Waddington was the guy that invented the term morphogenetic field, which Rupert Sheldrake has done a lot of work with. But he created morphogenetic field because the actual development, the pattern that all embryos went through, was coded nowhere in any individual cell. The overall form of the embryo that it was growing towards, the morphogenetic field that was controlling it, couldn't be reduced or found in any individual component of that embryo. But it was this overall field that was controlling it. Mm-hmm. So you take the head of a tadpole and the tail of a tadpole, cut them off, put the head where the tail is and the tail where the head was, and the tail will grow into a new head, and the head will grow into a new tail. So it's like, wow, just their location in the overall pattern is part of the determinant of their form. So where is that form stored? Take protein synthesis. Mm-hmm. When different laboratories around the world are first trying to synthesize a protein, and it's got hundreds of different molecules, that protein can literally fold into over several thousand different ways when it's created. And yet, as soon as it's created in one laboratory anywhere in the world, and it folds into one given pattern, all the proteins synthesized in all the other laboratories around the world fold into the same pattern. So where is that form stored?
Yeah, really.
So the actual form of development is stored someplace in this great form storehouse, but it's a real place. And as form is stored there, that form reaches a kind of a certain weight at some point, and it just reaches right down and helps control the manifest, conventional, finite world. And so any individual's form, any thoughts that you're having now, the behaviors, the actions that you're taking, are being stored in that big form storehouse somewhere. And so you are actually having a direct impact on the manifestation of the future form of evolution itself and reality itself. And so it's not true that you're not having an impact or can't have an impact. You're having an impact because the very form of the thoughts you're having now, the very types of ideas, the drives, the values that you hold are stored in that great form storehouse.
Yeah.
And so that's you're plugged into something that's happening whether you realize it or not. And so within all of that, you still have to find your own particular heart's desire, because even though this whole global thing that's happening, it's the sum total of a whole bunch of individuals contributing their own particular desires. And so the more clearly you can discover your own, then the better you're going to be able to impact this overall global phenomena.
Yeah, amen. Well, one of the exercises along those lines that I've often invited audiences to do is to take a piece of paper, draw a line down the middle, and then on one side list all the things that light them up, give them joy, turn them on, and that sort of thing, the things that they're good
right.
at. And at the top of that list, you put my great joy. And on the other side, list all the places where you're aware of in your community or in the world where you feel the world's needs. Not just where you intellectually know about what's needed, but where do you feel it? Where do you get angry, frustrated, and especially where do you feel compassion? Where does your heart just break over something that's happening in your community or in the world. And at
Right.
the top of that list, you put the world's great needs as I feel them. So you've got two lists, my great joy and the world's great needs. And then I say, just pay attention to your heart. You're trying to play mix and match, but let your heart guide you. Where are the intersections between what lights you up, what gives you joy, what gives you energy, and what the world's needs or your community's needs as you feel
Right.
them? And those places of intersection where your joy and the world's needs intersect, that's your calling, that's your mission, that's your vocation, at least at this time. And one of the things that I draw on, and it's somewhat different. I actually love what you've been just saying about, because I didn't think about bringing in the whole morphogenetic thing. But one of the things I've been talking about in terms of, the whole butterflies' wings in Hong Kong affects the weather in New York thing, that chaos thing. I said, it's not just your good works. Imagine that you positively impact only 3 people. I mean, you'll actually have a positive impact on hundreds, maybe thousands of people.
Right.
Let's just pretend it's only 3 people. And each of them goes on to significantly impact only 3 people. But one of them goes on to impact 30 million people that wouldn't have been impacted had you not made your little difference with these 3 people over here. And, then I'll often stop and I'll say, and the good news, what I call grace, is that it's not just your good works. Haven't there been people that have made a profound positive difference in your life because of their lousy example? I mean, they were just a real jerk, and you made some positive choice. And I say, and then so that everybody laughs, and then I say, now, do you honestly think that you haven't been blessing others in the same way?
Right.
And there's this sort of like, whoa, And that's what I find when I speak with young people. I just encourage them to follow those places where their joy and the world's needs intersect, and trust that whatever difference they make, it may make a difference in somebody else, and then ripple out in ways that are completely
exactly.
unpredictable.
And I think that plugging, the individual feeling into world feeling like that is a great way to do it. Immanuel Kant defined cosmopolitan, which is a world citizen, basically, as when anybody anywhere suffers, I suffer.
Yeah, amen.
And it was that solidarity feeling that brings one into a cosmopolitan space, into this global, encompassing, world-centric space where my own particular drives, desires, joys, and so on are directly interfacing with this entire planet and what's happening on it.
Exactly.
And so, in any number of ways that we can influence that, to influence 3 people, influence 30,000 direct morphogenetic fields, the point is we truly are interwoven with everything that's going on.
Exactly.
Well, Ken, so we can make a difference just literally by getting out of bed and what you do in the next 10, 15 minutes.
Amen. Well, Ken, just beginning to wind down here, I've got to ask you this question that Connie has asked me to ask everybody, and it's just a little off the wall, but it's fun.
Okay.
Which is, if you could have dinner or a beer or, lunch or whatever, but if you could, just spend some time over a meal or something like that with 3 people, any 3 people in human history. Or it could even be a dinner party where all 4 of you, these 3 people and you, are all together. Right. But who would those 3 people be, and why would you invite them?
Oh dear. Probably. There's so many, and good Lord, I spent so much time studying so many of the world's cultures. I have so many heroes in so many different places. But I'd probably say, representing Eastern traditions, somebody like Shankara, a great, in a sense, almost founder of Vedanta Hinduism.
Okay.
And then for Western, I would probably go with somebody like Plotinus. He really is the fountain of all Neoplatonic Gnosticism in the West, and even Bertrand Russell, when he was talking about philosophers and the good, the true, and the beautiful, and he said that the good belonged to Spinoza. He was just the most ethical philosopher you could think of. And the true, he never said, but presumably that belonged to Bertrand himself. But the beautiful he gave to Plotinus. He said, it's just the most beautiful system I've ever seen. And it's really astonishing And then the other one, just to get on the sort of conventional side of the street, there's a biography of this guy, and I read the preface of the gentleman who wrote it, and he said, there are times when you come across somebody that is so much of a genius that it's just beyond your capacity to describe how extraordinary a genius this person was, but simply off the scales in every direction. And he was talking about Isaac Newton.
Yes.
And so even though obviously not too many people are fond of Newton's actual, worldviews right now, although of course he stimulated virtually every modern science that came to the more advanced worldview it has today, and so they're all beholding to
exactly.
him. But just to actually interact with somebody of that degree of genius,
yes.
I think would just be a really interesting event. And of course, he was also an alchemist and magic and all sorts of things. It was said that he was not the first great scientist, but the last great mystic. But I think that would just be that'd be an interesting dinner party.
I think so. I actually enjoyed. Connie and I are just now rewatching Neil deGrasse Tyson's redo of Cosmos, and I actually really enjoyed the way he dealt with Isaac Newton. I thought it was we actually had a discussion about that, and one of the things that I spotted on that particular series was, again, how much Neil was really in servitude to scientific materialism. Because what he, in a sense, did is he goes all the way back to, comets and how all the cultures around the world saw them as disasters. And he pointed out that was pattern recognition, but it was what he called false pattern recognition. And so then on we go through history until we get to Isaac Newton. Now, everything up to Newton was still false pattern recognition. Human beings were not in touch with any sort of truth at all. They were only in touch with falsehood. Oh, I've got a different read. We could have an entire conversation just on this.
That's what he said. When we get to Newton, all of a sudden, Newton gets it right. And so he presents the Newtonian view as being right on the money for the first time.
Well, with respect to comets specifically, he wasn't. I don't think he was speaking beyond that.
He gave no limitations on Newton. He talked about his views of gravity and how they united the previous Galileo and Kepler views, which they did actually at that time. But now, of course, several hundred years later, Newton's actual views are looked at as false pattern recognition. Nobody looks at gravity as action in the distance. It's the result of a curvature in space-time, Einstein's view. Sure. And so Newton was also caught in false pattern recognition. And this is what you get when you look at developmental studies, is every stage of development sees a different world. Mm-hmm. And it sees the previous world more clearly than the previous world saw. So, as Hegel put it, every stage is adequate, every higher stage is more adequate. Or we could say every stage is true. For the conditions at that stage, it has its true versus false understandings. Yeah. And those are relatively correct, given the data they have. Then each higher stage is more true. But it's always going to be that way. I mean, if we look on the things that we believe today, and we look at how people will view them 500 years from now, virtually everything we believe in now will be part of false pattern recognition. 96% of the world is dark matter. We have no bloody idea what that is. And Neil's saying we know exactly what comets are, exactly where they come from. We know nothing about where they actually come from. The 96% of them is dark matter. But explain that.
Well,
anyway,
it's interesting. I was having a similar conversation just yesterday on some discussion forum where there were a number of people coming from a more humanist, atheist, skeptic, free thinker perspective, and they were sort of trashing conservative religion. And I said, before those of us who embrace an evidential worldview go about trashing earlier religious or spiritual worldviews, we might do well to take an evolutionary, ecological, and evidential approach to religions themselves. I mean, if you don't understand the evolutionary significance of religion, you're not going to be able to critique it in any accurate way whatsoever.
Right.
So,
yep.
well, Ken,
exactly.
I am so delighted. Like, we could just go on and on, but unfortunately, I've got another commitment. But if somebody wants to learn more of your work, I mean, obviously, there's such a broad body. But is there a website or a particular book or anything? Like, where would somebody, if somebody wanted to get more into your work or find out what your current, sort of stuff is, where would I send them?
In terms of books, people can still start with a theory of everything. Mm-hmm. And then there's a simple introductory book called The Integral Vision.
Yes.
And then there are a couple different websites. Probably the one that is most active right now is integrallife.com. Mm-hmm. And I carry weekly discussions or dialogues with various well-known experts in various fields on integral approach to various things. And people can find those there. And then once they pick up any one of those books, then they'll find a list of some 25 other books they can sort of pick off in any order they want.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Ken, thank you so much for this conversation and for your just amazing integrative work in the world. And I just, I know you've had your health challenges. I just wish you, many more years of good health, clear thinking, and good writing.
Bless you, my friend. I'm a big fan of your work as well as you know, and so this is a delight all around. And give Connie a big hug for me.
I definitely will. Great.
Okay, thanks, buddy.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.